This is Grant Adlam live from the Business Sense studio. We're sitting with Theuns Pelser from TWIMS. Now, TWIMS is a concept that a year ago, or a little bit over a year ago, I hadn't heard of. And Theuns, you're going to fill us in on exactly what TWIMS is, how it came about.
Yeah, 2 years ago I was approached, by Justin and his team that were just starting this concept of TWIMS, and the abbreviation stands for the Toyota Vessels Institute of Manufacturing Studies. I was really surprised with the initiative that they brought to the table there, because they came to us when I was the Dean of the Business School at the UKZN to actually inform us that they are setting up a business school in our territory here in Durban. And they weren't going to compete like the normal business schools would compete with the normal MBAs, PGDips and executive programs. And they've made a courtesy call with myself and the current DVC to inform us that they would like to get our blessing for this initiative. So this is where the first time I got to know the concept TWIMS. And then later on, Justin gave me a tour, the previous executive director of TWIMS, of the new campus that they've obtained. And it was just before the lockdown happened. And I think if you look at the conceptualization of TWIMS, it actually sprung out of the whole concept of industrialization. If you think about where Toyota have started with barred vessels, in 1961, that's basically when Toyota have started in South Africa. And that legacy of industrialization are being pulled through this initiative. And another very important key player was the then chairman of Toyota, Dr. Jan van Zyl, that unfortunately have passed away during COVID, which have seen that the manufacturing impetus in this country are taking a serious decline. And we all know how important the automotive sector is for exports and for job creation. So this whole initiative is built around job creation, economic growth, by way of helping manufacturers. And not only automotive, you will find that many of the chairs and the sponsors are coming from other sectors. So this whole initiative is primarily focused around the manufacturing base, but it's focused on all the sectors, and we want to actually expand in the other areas of manufacturing. So we are basically still a startup, because 2018 this was formed through the Barred Vessels Trust, a not-for-profit trust. And we are not for profit. I think the key thing for us is to be sustainable, paying the water and lights. But through sponsorships, through the trust, we also then sponsor MBA programs for new applicants. And then also through other initiatives with the community, like our master classes, executive programs. We would like to instill this knowledge and this awareness of manufacturing. And I think there's scope for us to also go further than just South Africa. We have a mandate to actually see if we can't industrialize Africa through this concept. So we are not your typical business school. Our business school is not to make money, although it's good for our financial people to be able to see that we pay our water and lights through our own efforts. But we really want to plow back into the manufacturing sector. And it's for us to actually leverage that institute. And that's the very important key for me, is the institute. Yes, we've got formal academic programs, the MBA, the postgrad diploma, which we partner with the Gordon Institute of Business Sciences. But that's not all we are. We are more than just the formal academic programs. We have to do with what the institute does when it comes to bringing out knowledge, creating the research, liaising with our corporates out there, addressing problems, policy development. And if you think about where our core competence lies within the manufacturing domain from a management capability. So we're not there as engineers, we're not there as scientists regarding manufacturing, but we are more focusing on creating leaders within the manufacturing domain.
TWIMS itself, what is the mandate? I know you covered a little bit of it, so yeah, I'll put it into a sentence. What is the mandate?
TWIMS' mandate is to create leadership capability within the manufacturing industry.
Okay. And then what is the difference between a traditional business school and yours? I know there's a big difference, so maybe you could just highlight that.
The biggest difference is all the business schools currently in South Africa are focusing on generic programs, generic management courses and content. Ours are very specific to the manufacturing. Yes, our formal academic programs do have some of these generic courses, but it's embedded through our electives that's focusing on these manufacturing competencies.
All right. So the obvious question, why the focus on manufacturing?
Once again, as I said, it comes from our founders. The need, as we've seen in the economy, in 2008, we saw basically a cyclical turn around with the manufacturing output towards the GDP, the gross domestic product of this country, where previously manufacturing have contributed such a big part of the economic growth of this country that we have seen this break in terms of a declining cycle of the manufacturing. So economic growth have seen a decline from 2008 and it's not recovering. We've seen the latest figures on the GDP where it was a negative contribution to the current GDP numbers that's still very low. Furthermore, GDP is also correlated with employment, and it's estimated that we have lost from 2008 till now like in the region of 400,000 jobs. Now, if we compare the sectors that contribute to the GDP, financial services is normally seen as a more advanced sector. It is focusing on professionals, it's focusing on a subset which doesn't create so much employment like your agriculture and your manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector, if you think about the manufacturing, have to do with the provision of OEMs, have to do with the ecosystems in which it operates, so the multiplier effect is very important, and I think that's where the biggest impact can be done for economic growth as well as job creation in this country.
The obvious question, but you have answered it earlier, but the benefits to industry of this are incredible. So maybe you just want to highlight that a bit.
It goes back to we have identified what are the problems within manufacturing in South Africa. One of the key things is there have been a major disinvestment within the manufacturing sector. How do we get investment back? And why do we want investment? Yes, it's for job creation, but so much more. If you just look at a good example with the automotive industry, most of our output that the manufacturers produce are going to overseas markets. But the overseas markets will only take up a product that are competitive. So when we do investment in the manufacturing sector, is to increase that competitiveness. So it's not just about throwing money and creating opportunity, but it's more to do also with the skills, the content and the know-how, how to be able to be competitive and to operate in the global economy. Because South Africa is part of this global economy. We can't rely on our own internal markets. Most of our products will compete with imports, like the cheaper products from China, India, etc. So our competencies, as we've seen with the automotive sector, is embedded with sophisticated markets like in Europe, where we need to have this competitive advantage through technologies, through investment, that can only be realized if we focus on the manufacturing sector.
The obvious question is, how do we stop deindustrialization?
I think there's two very important considerations here. Good example is the current energy crisis that we as South Africans are experiencing and some parts of the world as well. We call that a horizontal bottleneck. Horizontal bottlenecks have to do with infrastructural constraints. The South African government, per se, have neglected the investment in key infrastructures. We've seen that the focus was maybe more on areas like the financial services in your metro areas, where many of the industrial parks have been neglected by the metros and with the municipalities, with the lack of funds, roads, infrastructure, water and those things. So this is the horizontal bottleneck that needs to be addressed, and that's almost like the macro environmental constraints, the context in which we are, where we as industry leaders, as well as informed analysts and consultants, need to sit down with government and come up with solutions. The second part, which I think where we really can actually address through our know-how and our expertise, is what I would call the vertical bottleneck. Now, the vertical bottleneck have to do with your industry-related issues. It has to do with the industry problems or the challenges and constraints that we see. Now, again, if I can use the automotive industry as an example, we see the switch from the internal combustion engine towards the electrical vehicle. Many of our manufacturers that are exporting currently to the European countries are still focused on an internal combustion engine. So for me, that shows that there's a vertical bottleneck for us to address that competency so that we don't get caught with a competitive disadvantage. So it becomes critical for the industry through the initiative of TWIMS to be part of driving the policy with government, with the industry players in that sector, but also then to create an informed program where we can actually then educate leaders that can drive this particular changes through that industry-specific solutions. And that's where the know-how, the expertise, and many of our, if you look at our staff members, we have 8 faculty staff members, 3 sits with a doctorate, now excluding myself, and the rest all have master's degrees. So they are high experts in their field, and if you look at our offerings, they are competencies focused. They're focusing on where we see the manufacturing sector is going to move and how we can actually enhance the competitiveness with that content. So when we've developed the electives for our formal academic programs, we realized we can't just throw a lot of content out there that then doesn't have a storyline or doesn't tell a specific theme. So if you think about what the key pillars are, the following are the key pillars. 3 of them are based on a foundational pillar. And the first one that I can mention is our Industry 4.0, or the future of manufacturing. That's a very key one. We're talking about 3D printers, robotics. So it's all the new developments, new technologies that you'll find in the manufacturing sector. We also at our campus have what we call a sandbox. It's like a area where we can experiment with 3D printers. Robotics is one of the things that we want to expand in a sandbox so that we can actually connect the theoretical content that the students are being exposed to with a more practical feel, how it actually happens in the environment in which they're going to operate. The second one that's critical have to do with the sustainability of manufacturing. Now within the sustainability, we've got concepts like the sustainable financing. We also have green manufacturing, where we think about the reducing of the carbon footprint. So those are all the things that are talking to you in the United Nations Sustainable Report. That's the second pillar, and I foresee those things are going to continue for many years going forward. The third pillar, to make manufacturing be competitive and provide a job creation, is what I would say is that African trade and industrialization. So you need trade when you make something to be able to sell it in particular markets, and that's why it's so critical that we have that pillar embedded within our programs. And then the final pillar, which is the foundation of it all, is the so-called lean and supply manufacturing. The ethos, the philosophy of our programs are based on lean, meaning we want to achieve minimum downtime with quick turnaround, just-in-time manufacturing practices. So it's actually an efficiency-driven philosophy, where we try to maximize the output through the minimum inputs that you put without having defects or then breakages in your operation. And that philosophy, very interesting, is actually developed by Professor Deming from America many, many years ago, that weren't successfully accepted by many of the American firms, especially the automotive industry. And it was actually adopted by the Japanese through Toyota. So they've taken that philosophy and it is embedded in their programs, and you'll see many of the Japanese companies have used this philosophy in their manufacturing practices. The foundation of the programs are the lean philosophy, and derived from the thinking of Monosukuri, which is the making of things, is taking pride in what you make. So where most cultures, when I manufacture something, is to see an object to achieve something. With the Japanese culture, with this Monosukuri, it's more about the philosophy. How do you make the thing, and is there pride in making it? So it's almost like what you'll find with the craftsmanship of many years ago, where a person takes pride in what you do, And when there's defects in your manufacturing or even with a product that you are selling into market, that are seen as an embarrassment, that is seen as something that you would like to try avoid as far as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of manufacturing that we now see is use it for a short term and throw it away because it's not going to last. And I think you've seen it with, especially with Toyota and Lexus products, are registering very low defects internationally. And it has to do with that culture to avoid the breakages and defects that you will find in products, because they take the pride in manufacturing something. And it's not just in a product, it's also in their supply chains, their manufacturing operations, that all of this then are being brought together to support one another. And that's where the suppliers come in. You know, Toyota doesn't make its own airbags, for example, but it relies on suppliers that have that same ethos, the same philosophy of making a product, that have a very low defect, that have what I've called the monosaccharide principles embedded within.
All right. I think as a nation we should adapt this.
I think there's absolutely that, Grant, and I think there's pockets of excellence that we see that people have that passion for creating something. And unfortunately, we've missed that. We've missed that in many of our industry. We just see its input, a process, and an output. And we don't understand we're creating something with creative talent, with a human being behind that creations, and it's for somebody else's use. And that somebody else's is also a particular human being with a particular need. And I think that creates then this monosaccharide culture, that you're not just making it for a shelf, you're making for another human being. And I think that's where the connection also comes in. You know, sometimes we see manufacturing is a non-live operation, but there's a very important point. And you know, in my own development as a scholar, you know, the Austrian economics, for example, don't only see the economy as input and outputs. It also understands there's a consumer out there that wants value. They want to derive value from that product that they obtain. And you know, you've got a different value to a certain object that I will have for the same object. And unfortunately, your typical economic principles can't differentiate between that. It's only through the Austrian economic school that we can actually understand why do you have higher value for a certain product than I would have for you. And that's also embedded with this whole principle of the making of things in this monosaccharide philosophy.
I love it. And ultimately, it's all pride.
Absolutely. And I think that you will, if you go into manufacturing operations where the lean principles are embedded in, it's a clean environment. Why? Because they take pride in the environment. You know, if you not have that pride in your working environment, you're not going to spend time cleaning it up. I also believe because you take pride in what you're doing, you take responsibility for when things do go wrong. You know, you'll find it's typically in Japanese companies, when there's maybe a recall for a product failure, then you'll find that many of the leaders will step down. They will offer resignation much easier than in other countries and cultures, because they see it's their personal involvement, personal responsibility for not meeting the needs with that particular product for that consumer. And I think that shows that it is more than just numbers. It's more than just the operation of creating output through a factory.